Our next topic is exploring Masonic influences on the final writings of John E. Fetzer, and looking with Masonic eyes at the Fetzer guiding purpose. For this topic, we interviewed Akram Elias in the boardroom of the Fetzer Institute. First off will be a paragraph-by-paragraph discussion of the concluding portion of the white paper John Fetzer wrote to his board in 1989 regarding what he wanted the general principles of the ongoing Fetzer mission to be. This final portion of the white paper has come to be called Final Principles, and we discuss with Akram any Masonic influences on the notions Mr. Fetzer expresses in this paper. Then we turn to a set of writings compiled a decade later after John Fetzer's death by the Memorial Trust and Institute trustees. This set of writings includes the Fetzer guiding purpose, plus words on the meaning of spirit and on basic Fetzer assumptions, and the 2016 era Fetzer Institute mission statement. This next topic is pertaining to the writings of John Fetzer in the last year of his life, 1989, when he was busy trying to articulate to his board what he wanted the general principles of the ongoing Fetzer mission to be. They're very esoteric writings, particularly the first one we're going to look at. He wrote in a somewhat obtuse style and very esoteric style. But for Akram, we're not sure where and what phrases and where and what notions in this writing might be Masonic. So we're hoping for you to just comment on these writings that we're going to discuss together today.
Be glad to do so.
The first one has come to be called Final Principles. John Fetzer wrote a white paper to his board in 1989, which has come to be called the Founder's Statement. And the last section of that paper has come to be called Final Principles. So if we can run through this kind of paragraph by paragraph. In the first paragraph, there's this notion of listening to the ring of truth. It says, I am sure that as you listen, you will hear the ring of truth. First and foremost, trying to create a community of freedom within the Institute, which is based on then a series of freedoms. Freedom of consciousness, freedom of the individual, freedom of movement, freedom of thought, freedom of development, and freedom of expression, which will allow the Institute to succeed in its mission and to find balance within and without in the educational process. So what in there is Masonic in your mind? I've wondered if the ring of truth is a Masonic notion in some way.
Absolutely. Truth, faith, charity, three fundamental precepts in Masonry, truth being the most important. That is the path that each and every individual Freemason is supposed to craft on his own, on her own, ultimately towards the truth. And truth starts from within. In other words, the person has to start listening to oneself. So meditation, know thyself, as we say in Masonry. The community of freedom within the Institute is such a Masonic concept. I mean, let me explain. We are, in Freemasonry, we call ourselves the Society of Freemasons. This is not an organization. It's a society of Freemasons. So the concept of freedom here. And the Masonic Lodge is conceived as the incubator, the place where the individual learns first and foremost how to be free. Now, freedom in Masonry has two aspects, and I heard you read the entire set of principles, so I'll address the second concept later because he's alluding to it in a later paragraph. But right here, he's talking about freedom of consciousness, the freedom of, or freedom to. So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom to think here, all the things that relate really to the great experiment and the founding fathers of the United States and what this country is all supposed to be all about. So the Masonic Lodge is the place where the individual learns first and foremost how to be free as an individual. This individual freedom is very important because if you crush the freedom of the individual, you crush the freedom of all. So first and foremost, each human being needs to strive to be free. And you do that first by following your own path, and tools are given to you in Masonry to do so. However, you learn very quickly through the Masonic Lodge that you cannot do it by yourself. So it's a matter of balance. There is that initiative, there is your own path, but you need the community support. The community support is the brotherhood, what we call the sacred band of brotherhood. And that's what the Lodge is about. So I think here what John is really referring to is the Institute being the incubator, the place where this community of freedom. So having people working here concentrate on how to promote that concept of freedom among each and every individual, but at the same time have that community support, so it becomes the community of freedom. And by definition, the community of freedom is unstoppable because you created a community of free individuals. This is the best antidote against any form of tyranny over the mind of man.
Let me jump in here and ask you a specific question about a phrase here, because Mr. Fetzer talks about not freedom of conscience, but freedom of consciousness. And can you talk about the development of consciousness within Freemasonry?
Absolutely. It's all about, in fact, consciousness and having the Freemason realize that there is a higher consciousness, that each and every individual is really part of the whole. And the initiatic process or the initiatory process is all about awakening that consciousness. And part of developing that consciousness has to do with understanding the enlightened concept of freedom. And the enlightened concept has that dual aspects, which then he refers to later on, which is the freedom from, not just freedom of.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like the four freedoms, the four freedoms of Roosevelt.
Well, definitely. Roosevelt's Four Freedom speech, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt was a Freemason, and he's obviously the four freedoms are hitting on both in short form, but freedom of and freedom from. And it's important, the freedom from tyranny, freedom from fear, freedom from ignorance, freedom from extremism.
Freedom from want.
Freedom from want. These freedom from superstition, these freedoms from are equally important to the freedom of, because if this is the other part of the consciousness, this is what's going to help guide me to act when I do freedom of, because I can do freedom of to destroy instead of building, freedom of to hate instead of loving. It's the other part. So both are.
Well, it's interesting that Mr. Fetzer was in Washington exactly when FDR articulated those. So it's an interesting kind of historical connection.
Well, things happen sometimes for a reason.
Yeah.
And let me jump in one more time with this notion of the ring of truth. I'm wondering if there's a connection there with the notion of the lost word that's in the Masonic tradition. It's certainly in the Rosicrucian tradition. So listening to a ring of truth, is that a spiritual notion of listening to actually the word of providence or the word of God, and actually referring to a spiritual experience where you're listening for inner guidance that really comes in a tangible way. If you're working in inner practice, that guidance can really come to you in a very tangible way. As a ring, as a word?
Yes, and we do, absolutely. And although in different rituals within Freemasonry there are attempts to interpret esoterically what the lost word is, the one point where all of them converge is that the lost word will remain lost forever, because it is really within the person. There's nobody who's gonna from the outside tell you what it is. And that is the big difference between a secret and a mystery. Secrets, so lost word, if it's a secret, you can reveal it, you can communicate it. If it's a mystery, you have to live it. You can't communicate a mystery. That is the main difference between secrets and mysteries.
And even if you experience it, it's ineffable.
It is ineffable.
So the community of freedom is really a community of experience as well as a community of belief or anything else.
Correct. What it has is that it's very enriching, and it's empowering, because when an individual is experiencing and living his own or her own path towards that enlightened freedom, knowing that there are others going through their own experiences and being able to communicate and share experiences is very empowering. So the concept of the community of freedom becomes unstoppable. It has power that is beyond imagination. It has nothing to do with the way the profane, the people on an ordinary basis in everyday's language use power or think of power as something that you're asserting. Right? This is
Oppression. Right.
Absolutely. This is the power that frees, which means you can't subdue it. It cannot be subdued.
So that fits with freedom of movement, which you can think of literally, but also metaphorically.
Yes. Movement outside, movement within and out, up and down.
That's
at different
interesting.
levels.
Movement in, yeah.
Well, and I'm thinking back again to when we were at the House of the Temple in the lodge room, and the experience where you took us to the altar, and there are these various holy books, and the statement you made from Kipling, where you had people of various spiritual traditions together in a room doing a common practice together. So that's different than being a community that each is free to go his own way. Where you bring, instead, how it hit me is in the lodge room, the key is that these various people that are all going their own ways come together and experience something together, have a spiritual experience together.
Absolutely, and this is where that freedom of consciousness, becomes very important. That higher consciousness that basically connects individuals who may have different religious persuasions, and if they're stuck only with that and not understanding why there are other persuasions. So here's the idea. This is why loving thy neighbor, for example, has a completely different concept in Masonry. I mean, I can go to my Catholic church, and on my right, on my left, everyone is Catholic. I go to my synagogue, on my right, on my left, everybody's Jewish. I go to my Hindu temple, my Buddhist temple, whatever it is. That is easier to deal with. In the Masonic Lodge, bringing people of different religious persuasions coming together and experiencing as a community now things in common. So on my right is a Jew, on my left is a Protestant, in front of me is a Buddhist, behind me is a Hindu, as Kipling mentioned, in his poem, My Mother Lodge, talking about all these religions. This is where the higher consciousness comes in. And this is when people learn the concept of freedom, truly enlightened freedom. There are different ways to connect to the truth. And the idea on earth for us as human beings is not to kill one another in the name of one truth versus one relative truth versus the other. It is how do we come together and learn to appreciate our differences while at the same time each one pursuing his or her own truth. And that is part of that community of freedom. It's very challenging. It is not easy, but that's what the great experiment of America is all about.
Right.
Bringing people, the e pluribus unum, the out of many one, out of many of religions, of races, of ethnicities, of nationalities, of cultures, coming together, creating this extraordinary experiment. And the lodge embodies that. That's its purpose. And John Fetzer is talking about the Institute perpetuating that for the purpose of the American experiment, to keep it moving forward.
Yeah. Great. Anything else? Okay. That's wonderful. Community freedom is very important here as a notion contemporarily these days, so those words are very useful and very deep.
Well, every generation of Americans faces the challenge, because America is a great experiment. And remember always Benjamin Franklin's words: "We gave you a republic, if you can keep it." The founders laid the experiment and established a system of checks and balances, everything they could come up with, which was ingenious for that period. But they understood this is a building in process. It has to be built. It's an experiment. Therefore, citizens' engagement in that experiment is fundamental. This is the one experiment in humanity that requires that citizen participation that is so dependent, its success and failure depend on citizen engagements. Monarchies do not require that kind of citizen engagements. Okay, so therefore every generation of Americans is going to face challenges. That's life. So how do you relate to that? And this is where that concept of the community of freedom is important. Every generation of Americans has to preserve, rekindle. So now we are at a state in this country where the concept of the community of freedom is endangered. But every generation, when we went through that, through the Civil War, the 60s, the Great Depression, this is the history of the experiment. Even the founders, okay, had to create this. Yeah. So the community of freedom,
it's inherent.
You can be a Jeffersonian, you can be a Hamiltonian, you can be at odds. I mean, totally two different visions. But the community of freedom helps you come together and build, irrespective of these very, very strong differences. And we're right now, our generation is going through this as we speak.
The next paragraph, I think, pertains to individual practice, to individual spiritual practice, I believe, and see what you think, and where there are echoes of Masonic philosophy here, if possible. Over a period of time, if a greater liberation to find balance is to manifest on this planet, this freedom must first manifest. The liberation of the individual, on the individual level, manifests when one cries out for freedom. Free me of these bonds, of these chains. Free me of these pains, these anguishes. Free me and bring me into that place of loving. When one calls out in such a way, the consciousness of liberation is stirred within, as well as without, and liberation becomes reality. This is how the liberating action begins to free one of the downward and turns in a spiral of consciousness and brings one into the higher focus, back into your higher self. It is here that you will find the answers to the final definition of the Institute's purpose in accordance with the agenda we have put in place.
What can I say, Tom? A Mason candidate knocking on the door, wanting to become a Freemason, is asked one fundamental question: were you first prepared? And the answer universally is in my heart. Love is the thing to unlock, but it's within. Each person is going to have to chart his, her own path to find it, because it is an internal journey first that will help you then chart your external journey. You don't start with it's not the external, it is the internal that's going to drive you towards the external. It's within the internal that lies the kernel of the truth that we're talking with a capital T. So this is the reason why empowering the individual to pursue his or her own path is fundamental. And that explains to you why in Freemasonry, the lodge is the incubator. It has the society, the community of support, of brotherhood. However, tools are given. The Mason is never told what to do, how to do it. The Mason is told, you need to be free so you can be a builder of your community. Now here are tools. So we use tools like the square, like the compasses, like the gavel, like the plumb. These, each and every one of them has its own esoteric meanings, and then when they come together, there are dynamic meanings also. But then each person is going to use those to apply them internally so they can free themselves, get to that consciousness and know how to act. So it's important to keep in mind, the idea of the community of freedom is to create free individuals and empower them, not to control them. That is the liberating. That's the idea. So here what John is talking about, the Institute, is that the Institute should be the place that will enable, out of the people working here, entrusted to govern it and operate it, is to create the environment in this incubator that will help produce that community and freedom, not to control anything, it's to free. This is the true liberation. If one aims at controlling, even with all the good intentions, if the aim is to control the path, to control the direction, self-defeating. You unleash energies and you let them go. But with love anchored, you know where those energies will go. They're not going to be destructive. So that's the key part.
It seems like in this paragraph, he's talking about a process, a kind of initiation. Basically making the determination that you want to be free, manifesting this, and then achieving the freedom and essentially achieving the higher consciousness. Can you talk about the initiatory process in Freemasonry and how this might have had an impact on this kind of thinking?
Sure.
Specifically, by the way, he talks about, if I can,
Sure.
sorry to interrupt, but
Sure.
talking about consciousness of liberation is stirred within and becomes a spiral of consciousness up into the higher self. So there is an image of an inner process that is this inner upward spiral
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
spiritual enlightenment,
Yes.
awakening.
Absolutely. It is a process, and the process starts always with self and will continue with self, but then starts manifesting itself outwardly. But the self first is the heart. And this is where there's got to be a thirst inside. One. Second, a will. And that is why in the process, first were you prepared, and the second step is it of your own free will? So will and love need to come together. And this is where reason and beauty come together. Okay, but it starts within the person. Yes, and the initiatory process of going through the 3 degrees is to help the individual unleash that internal energy that will help create that connection. And that spiral going upward, basically we use it in our 2nd degree, and that's what we refer to as the stairway, Jacob's ladder. There are different ways of dealing with it, but in the 2nd degree it's very clear. And the idea is, how do you move from where you are here to that higher level of consciousness towards the light? Because that's really where the connection exists. So yes, it is a process, and the 3 degrees are all about that.
But it's not an easy process too. I mean, he talks about pain.
Of course it's not, and that is why in in Masonry, this is symbolically conveyed to the candidate. It's what we call the trials. You're going through sets of trials, and the most difficult one is the 3rd trial, which is the spiritual trial. This is where your foundational is really shaken, and how do you jump to the spiritual enlightenment? That's the 3rd degree, and that is why you hear the expression in English, give someone the 3rd degree. I mean, this is like the test, okay? But it is not easy. It's
The
not
crucible,
supposed to be.
the
It
heat,
is.
the
Yeah.
heat of the light shining down. It's a crucible. Yeah. But this spiral of consciousness. So what I think about is in the lodge, the ritual creates a spiritual intensity. And even though this is an individual process of the spiral, that in the lodge, doing the common ritual, all these various diverse people doing the common ritual, the spiritual intensity of that common practice done in the lodge at that moment creates an intensity that is powerful and can create breakthroughs for people, inner breakthroughs for people.
And bind people together into community.
It is. It is all, it's a common effort. It's everybody's participating. I mean, the reason why typically, as I'm not revealing any secrets here, not because the secrets are not known, but because I took an obligation, I respect my obligation, as we say. But this is something that is out there. That is the reason why the candidate is typically blindfolded. And the idea is that candidate is already learning the concept of trust and relying on a trusted hand. You cannot do it by yourself. Okay, your effort, your initiative, your heart, your will are essential. Without that, nothing's going to happen. So that is always has to be nurtured, has to be driven, but know that you will not achieve it by yourself. You need that trusted hand of the community. We call it the sacred band of the lodge. So the participation, that's where everybody's participating in the ceremony. The candidate is going through it, but it is with the support of the whole community that exists within the lodge that empowers that. And honestly, if it is done really nicely, the person will feel something going up and down his spine or her spine. I mean, you'll feel it. I mean, I know in my case.
So the spiral is more than
so
a
well.
metaphor. It's an experience.
I mean, in my case, it was done superbly in my mother lodge, and I truly felt it. I felt something.
And it creates, they experience an intense spiritual energy together that the group creates, a diverse group creates. And I think I'm interested in how, and you're speaking to that, because to me it also creates a bonding where people get a sense of the spiritual experience as being a universal experience, as well as an individual experience, and each path going differently. There's also a common universal aspect to this that can be experienced in the group when you're sitting in the group. And I would assume that that's part of, the Masonic guys will go, gee, I'm a Hindu, he's a Jew, we're Muslim, but together during this practice, we're creating this spiritual experience together. So I don't have to be only with my group to do that. I can do that when in any group where there's a spiritual intention and a practice with focus and receptivity and all that.
Well, that's exactly what it is. This is why a Freemason is constantly encouraged to come to lodge as often as he or she can. Never at the expense of your other things that you have to do. So we call that the cable tow. You got to understand your obligations toward your profession, toward your family, toward whatever you believe in. But the lodge is a place that helps you replenish your battery, your energy. So it's having, so for us, since we are a community, we don't as a lodge, the lodge doesn't do anything outside in the world. It does only charity. In other words, we support charities. The lodge never takes any position on social matters, on political matters, on religious matters of these. No, the idea is to create a community of freedom. Individuals go and try to build. But where do they need to replenish? And know that they're not on their own. Back to the lodge. And that's how they continue these linkages, unseen, untouched necessarily linkages. They can understand one another and leverage that as they build better communities. So I can understand if this institute, John's vision is that this institute needs to have that community of freedom. Well, how do you create a process of having that energy replenished? One of the things is to be able to have this meditation exercise of people of different religions come together so they can understand this concept of community of freedom and take not only pride, but gain support. I'm not on my own. This is very important. A human being needs that. I am not on my own. And that explains to you why, even in ordinary things, somebody's going through a crisis, somebody who's gone, coming out of cancer, somebody who went through depression. There's that. It's called the community support. Get with others who have gone through this. There's that. You're not on your own. I mean, that's part of who we are as human beings. So the balance is very, very important. It's all about equilibrium.
And I think this next paragraph is pertaining to the assistance that's available once the person decides to begin the process. John wrote, "I believe there is a certain consciousness of synthesis that brings forth a light that some refer to as the avatar symmetry that is here, ready to assist all who are connected with the Institute to delineate its mission."
Yeah, makes perfect sense. A Mason is taught, one of the first things you're taught before engaging in any great or important undertaking, you should invoke the blessing of deity. That is the divine providence, as the founders refer to it. Things are not disconnected. Once one travels down that road towards higher consciousness and unleashes that, they're in touch. So that's why we say the blessing of deity. This is important. It's not praying. You understand the esoteric meaning here. So that's what he's talking about, of course. So if the Institute is really connected to that, then of course they will be guided. At some point, a door closes and suddenly a door opens. But no one will see the door opening unless they're connected to that. And that's when you start seeing what others don't see. That's when you understand why some things have to come to a close in order to open a new path or open another door that gets you somewhere else. But if one is not going to, these don't appear, therefore they're not seized upon.
There's this really interesting phrase, avatar symmetry, and I wonder if there's any analog in Freemasonry to this kind of idea. Now we're going to have to unpack what avatar and symmetry means as a phrase, but I'm wondering if is there any kind of connection with Freemasonry?
Well, everything has to do with symmetry in Freemasonry. And the idea being there is always that duality. Mm-hmm. So in the exoteric, there is the duality, darkness, light, male, female, day, night, whatever, positive energy, negative energy. The idea is in Freemasonry, what appears to be as opposites, in fact, this is part of a symmetry. Mm-hmm. And the Mason needs to find her own point of equilibrium. So you are the third pillar. If you look at what appears as a duality, or the opposites, are the two pillars, and this is why typically the candidate goes through two pillars and has these two pillars constant. This is why you have the checkered floor, mm-hmm. Or the mosaic pavement mm-hmm. of black and white squares, which you see here nicely with this black. I saw the black, the fountain with the black, and then the white crystal, black and white. This is part of the journey. Mm-hmm. So symmetry is key, and to get that's where you get harmony. This is where you build harmony. Okay, and the Mason is taught to pursue that, to find his own point of equilibrium, to have harmony within her own life, mm-hmm. and then harmony within the community, which is the lodge, and then from there taking it outside to the community at large.
So in terms of Freemasonry, it seems like symmetry is really embodied in geometry. It's the whole emphasis on,
Well, that's why you have the letter G in the universal symbol of Freemasonry. Uh-huh. And people should never mistake that letter G for the initial G of God. It is geometry, because mm-hmm. we refer to the divine, to the creative force, as the grand architect or the grand geometrician. In fact, the person doesn't really know as they come into Freemasonry. They're not introduced to the letter G in the first degree, so they hear about the grand architect. They don't. It's when they get into the path, midway, they're introduced to the letter G, and that is geometry. And that's why in the Mason in the second degree, which is the second trial, this is where her intellect is tried. How do you create that freedom, intellectual freedom? First and foremost, you have to pursue the knowledge in the arts and sciences. So the several liberal arts and sciences are important, but we always say the fifth one, geometry, is the most important. And we say it's the most important because it brings beauty and reason together. So in geometry, there is a plan. You use reason, you use science, but then geometry brings beauty. Science without beauty doesn't make it. And beauty without science stays up there. So, and beauty for us is the word, that code word that we use for love, okay? Because only love produces beauty. Hate does not produce beauty.
And everybody, when we say geometry, it conjures up memories of, primary school.
Euclidean geometry.
And memorizing axioms. But I think it's interesting because there's an esoteric meaning to geometry here in that it actually sketches out the structure of the cosmos. And again, that connection, that symmetry between as above, so below.
It is, absolutely. And anybody who knows anything about mathematics and geometry, really anybody who really digs in deeper into that, realizes there is a spiritual foundation. There is a leap of faith not in any specific religion, in this providence. It connects, and I was very fortunate in my youth when in high school. I went to a special high school where math was heavily emphasized. And I had this teacher, first teacher of mathematics, who came in without any books and said, "Listen, kids, if you really want to unlock the mysteries of this universe, mathematics is the key for everything." Wow. And then, of course, the deeper you get into that, the more you realize it is. And it brings the above, the below. It puts things. There is a huge esoteric significance to geometry.
How about the idea of avatar, an ascended being who descends to help, to aid? And it's not clear in this statement whether that's meant metaphorically or literally or what, but is there any analog in Freemasonry for that?
Metaphorically. In other words, that's when we say, for example, before engaging in any important undertaking, important. You're making something you're building, you're going to improve something. It's important, it's not mundane. Invoking the blessing of deity, different from praying. Invoking the blessing of deity is the metaphor. That is, this is how you connect with that divine, with providence. Are you going to tell me that when Washington and Valley Forge was meditating, what was happening? This experiment was meant to be. This did not happen just like that. It doesn't happen. 55 men or all, it doesn't happen. The experiment there was something providential behind it, okay? And it was meant because to help the human condition move forward. You had to have a place to do it, to start telling people you can't keep reliving the past. If you are to liberate yourself as humans, you have to start thinking and operating differently. Enlightenment is key. And this new world provided the lab, and the founders were the architects, but they couldn't do it by themselves. They were connected, so that providence was very important. Why do you think Thomas Jefferson went and studied all the esoteric schools? He studied every religion. Why? I mean, what was it? It was important to connect.
So I'm getting that now, that there's an analog between this writing, actually, and the Founding Fathers, the whole American experiment, the group calling out for the help of providence together, and then this paragraph, America's Agony in Washington and Valley Forge, that's what came to mind this time, for the first time, that you can imagine once Washington moved into this consciousness of synthesis, where he was able to synthesize being in the physical body and moving into a spiritual experience as well, that the avatar appears, the angel comes. And for the angel isn't just above, but above and is below as well, because she's able to communicate to him. So he gets the communication, he gets the help he needs, he brings it to the whole group, to the whole army. So I see it, I get it.
And that's what in different religions, that is expressed differently in different ways, through saints, through angels, through Holy Ghost, in different ways. This is the universal concept that connects, obviously, ultimately, if one looks at it esoterically, it connects everybody to the whole.
Yeah. Well, getting back to America's Agony and Washington's vision, it's interesting that it's a vision of 3 trials. And it seems to fit very well with this kind of Masonic notion of the 3 degrees.
Yep, it makes absolute sense. The 3 degrees, the 3 trials. John Fetzer talks about it. America, we are now at the 3rd trial, which is really the spiritual trial, which is the most difficult. Again, in Masonry, this is the most difficult, the 3rd degree, and where, without again revealing things that I'm not supposed to reveal because I took an obligation. However, fundamentally, the 3 enemies appear. They're hidden. They're hidden before, but they appear. Ignorance, extremism, and tyranny. And it starts always with ignorance. The more people stay away from knowledge, the more they buy into stereotypes, collective imagery, false assumptions, superstition, you name it, whatever. Ignorance is fundamental to move people away from freedom. The more knowledgeable they are, the more difficult they are to control. So ignorance is the #1 ingredient for the enemy of the community of freedom. Okay, so that's #1. Then from ignorance, you come to the second enemy, which manifests itself, and that is extremism. Now you build on the ignorance to start promoting hate, divisiveness, these stupid people, these bloodsuckers, okay, so to divide, to separate. This is important because when you're able to separate communities, that is when you're now able to control them better. So with ignorance and extremism, and of course anyone who falls prey to extremism has lost his or her freedom. That's it, because now somebody's pressing your button and pushing you. And now you have communities that are set apart, which means this is where you can exercise now tyranny. That's the 3rd law. So the whole experience esoterically of the spiritual trial is facing these 3. And without that spiritual enlightenment, you can't face them. You can't. It's very easy to fall into ignorance, into stereotyping. It's very easy to fall into extremism. It is that spiritual enlightenment that forces people to think about creating the community of freedom. You see, and what is the community of freedom? If you have people, individuals, forming the community, going back to the lodge, the same thing, of different persuasions, political persuasions, religious persuasions, of different cultures, of different ethnicities, you're building the fabric of the community of freedom. The more you divide, the easier it becomes for tyranny to take root. So here's the deal. Diversity is very challenging, but unless diversity is incorporated, using the words of today, not demeaned, not abused, figuring out how to incorporate diversity to bring communities to have these linkages and understand that my well-being depends also on yours. If we're separate, it is easy to go to war. It is easy to hate because we don't have common interests, we don't have common values, we don't have anything in common. There is no bridge. So that is why the 3, and that's where the Mason really understands how difficult the 3rd trial is, because without that spiritual alignment, there is no way on earth to conquer these three.
Thank you. Excellent. In the final paragraph, John writes, remember, whatever the final verdict turns out to be, its summary will be unconditional love. That is our avatar of the future. Because love is the unifying energy field that mobilizes the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual resources in the caring and sharing with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. But that's what I was talking about. The idea is don't think about controlling the outcome. People often with very good intentions, they feel they need to control the process. It's self-defeating. As soon as you start thinking, how do I control it? How do I control the outcome? You're defeating yourself. Love is the starting point, and this is where you end. As long as you keep that in mind, and that is your guiding force, you're creating a community of freedom. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. You may not even see it. You may never understand it. The idea is don't try to control it. That's what he's referring to. But keep that guiding force. This is what ultimately is going to bring this human condition to the next level of consciousness. And of course, America is connected to it, because if the experiment fails here, this is our big trial now. If the great experiment of the United States fails, God help us. In other words, we are connected to the destiny of humanity. I am not here trying to sound like superior or anything like that. Please don't get me wrong. This experiment has to do with improving the human condition. Okay? So the success brings success here. Failure brings failure here. We're connected. Why? Because the whole world in microcosm is here in this country. So how we're experimenting with the new challenges, if we remain connected to this concept of community of freedom, freedom from, not just freedom to, we will not repeat the past. But if we fall prey to the forces that are trying to suck us back into the past by using hatred, by using the means to settle disputes, by trying to have one group overcome the other, instead of coming together, learning from one another, and working as a community together. And love is fundamental to that. Well, what's going to happen? The United States of America, the great experiment, will turn into what humanity has known until 1776, rolling back. So we're at the verge. If we succeed here, we're going to help pull humanity to the next level, because the forces of destruction are so big. They're so huge. And knowledge, science, technology by themselves won't do it, because all you have to do is look around you what's happening in the world. They can be used to build or to destroy. And nobody today, no longer, nobody has a monopoly over that knowledge. We're in the midst of this knowledge revolution. We see it at all levels. You attack, you will be attacked. You hit, you'll be hit. You do this, for every action, there's definitely a reaction. Now we see it, we feel it globally. So we're at that verge. We either move to the next level of higher consciousness, or we fall behind. And the American experiment is connected to the human condition. And I fully understand the mission of the Fetzer Institute. Makes sense. John's vision and having this institute try to be here, create this community of freedom, which means it has dual function. It's the way I look at it. Domestic, engaging the great experiment here to bring back this concept of community of freedom. We need it now. This generation needs it. But because of globalization and interconnectedness more than ever, it has to be global as well. So dual function, community of freedom here and globally. Yeah, makes sense to me.
Thank you, Akram.
My pleasure.
So there are words then around the meaning of spirit that the Institute Board put down to sort of a few short statements about the meaning of spirit. We are acutely aware that our inquiry to know spirit is incomplete and everlasting, and that we can neither fully understand nor adequately describe spirit. We offer this description not to be definitive, but to encourage further exploration and discourse. And then, first of all, by spirit we mean that universal spirit that is the deepest and most inclusive ground of being. Spirit is the source of all that exists. Secondly, spirit is the infinite creative energy that gives birth to the universe. Thirdly, spirit is the common source of the world's faith traditions. And fourthly, spirit is the love that creates and sustains life.
Well, I think it's a great way of defining as a starting point for conversation and bringing people together. That humility in not coming up with one clear definition is not only very important, because we always need to humble ourselves but realize that the more we learn, the more we discover how ignorant we are. It's a quest that is really never ending in a way, and that's part of the whole enlightenment journey. But aside from that, if to be true to the idea of community of freedom, if we say this is it, then we've shut the door.
You've lost it immediately.
Lost. So, I mean, it is not only humble, and it's important to do that, but it's also very important and practical, and suits the mission and the guiding principle of the Institute by offering, a base that is wide enough and that is stating this is not to have a final and a clear definition of what it is, but hitting on some of the universal concepts, tying spirit to love, understanding that there is a foundation in every faith of spirituality. That's basically what it's about. And that's why the human race, human beings, every society throughout history has always struggled with this. This is the most difficult thing to put, for people to put their hands on. And that explains to you why it becomes very easy for dogmatic, extremist individuals to twist religious foundations of every and any religion easily, using ignorance, promoting extremism, so they can control, and then create chaos, disarray, hatred, etc. So what really brings people together is by saying there is a spiritual foundation for everywhere that brings us together. This is something universal. We can't define it, but if we come together and work together, that's the closest we're going to ever get. That diversity within the unity of spirit is fundamental. Diversity within the unity. So no one is above the other. Okay? And that's what creates really the community of freedom.
In Freemasonry, are there discussions of spirit in terms of, in this document, it's spoken about in terms of energy, in terms of love. How is spirit basically defined and talked about in Freemasonry?
Pretty much in similar ways, in the sense that we tell the Mason that he or she has to pursue his or her own spiritual enlightenment. The person, as they come in, they take an oath. In each one of the degrees, they always take oaths. Mm-hmm. And the oath is taken on a volume of the sacred law, whatever book they choose to believe in. The square and compasses, because the square and compasses are to teach the Mason that no matter what the volume of the sacred law is, they're all equal, they're all great out of respect. You may choose one.
Right.
But no matter
Symmetry.
Yeah, but no matter what book it is, there'll always be people who will use ignorance, who will take excerpts from any volume of a sacred law, twist play on ignorance, play on feelings and passions, use extremism to preach hatred. As a Mason, you have to be a kindled spirit. You have to be free, a free builder. It means you should never be led blindly at that level of who you are, that spirit which is within you. If you let that happen, you've killed your spiritual being. So to keep your spiritual being free, we're not going to tell you what it is, how you're going to do it. It's yours. But to keep it, no matter what religious path you follow, employ always the square and the compasses. The square teaches you how to deal with others, to be on the level with them, to be upright with them. And the compasses will help you as you enlarge and expand your knowledge, you grow a bigger circle. As long as you stay within that circle, it's difficult to err. In other words, don't let your emotions, your fears, when you step outside of the circle, that's the unknown. And that's what can be, you employ your compasses to circumscribe your passions, your desires, understand the square, and that's why both are put on the volume of the sacred law. It's the three together. That's how you pursue your spiritual, and that then helps in building this community of freedom, of individuals who are of different religions, but somehow understand how to build with one another. First, respect one another. And second is build. It's coming together, it's more than coexistence. It's coming together, creating a shared vision that is more universal, that helps us move forward. As a country, as a people, that community of freedom is essential. Therefore, defining spirit in that matter is fundamental. So we approach it the same way, and we tell the person, you've got to pursue your own spiritual enlightenment. Keep in mind, no matter what religious path you may follow, what religion you adopt, no matter what, just keep in mind, these are your brothers, these are your sisters. And although they are diverse, there is one thing that brings us together, the universality of spirit. And to help you always, when you face trials, use the compasses and the square to help you. Take a step back and not be blinded and driven into any form of extremism. The compasses is to avoid extremism, and the square is to remind you, he is your brother, she's your sister. Level and be upright.
Well, it seems in terms of the language of the spirit that's used in the purple sheet, there's a nice kind of symmetry between the lodge and the institute. Because it seems what it's saying here is the institute is kind of a channel for the energy of spirit, which then gets radiated out to the community and beyond through love.
Hello, it's obvious to me. That's the whole idea of creating this institute, and that's why even its architecture. I mean, when I first came here, I just couldn't believe it. I mean, to me, it hits me right there in the face. It's clear, without having read anything, before I delved into this whole Fetzer. I mean, it hit me. It's right there. I could see it. I could feel it. Of course, that's what it is. So even physically, the building was designed to facilitate.
The whole story. It tells the whole
to
story.
facilitate that. Absolutely. The lodge is the incubator, the sacred space, we call it, the sacred space, the incubator, where these energies are developed, helped, developed, unleashed, channeled, and create this concept of community, society of freedom. Here, it's called the community of freedom, the building, the institute, is exactly that, an incubator to channel that. The building physically has been structured to do that the same way we structure the lodge in ways, to help us with that. This is to help people relate constantly, physically. That's when I say to Americans when they visit Washington physically, I say, when you see these monuments, these physically are there to help make a lasting imprint, to make you think, oh my God, what is this country all about? It's to remind you of what America is about. I mean, this Washington Monument, this Capitol, this is not just done like that. So this building, every time one enters and leaves or works out of this building, is constantly reminded of what is important is for people to think, to really ask, I'm here. What's my purpose? So Absolutely. Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. That's what I was, for me, it's
In
obvious.
some traditions, they say the Great Pyramid is a resurrection machine, and when I walk in Fetzer, I always think that this is a resurrection machine, metaphorically. Not
Well, it's
not
you're renewing.
literal resurrection.
Yeah,
but
yeah. Well,
metaphorically.
it is. I mean, if you look at it this way, metaphorically, it means you're constantly renewing yourself, and that's important. And it is important because it reminds the person not to relive the past. This is fundamental. I cannot stress this enough. And I saw that in his writings. I understand from what this institute is trying to, and I know it from what Masonry is about. The idea for the great experiment is not to relive the past. This is freedom from the past. From the past.
Well, the next set here are called Fetzer assumptions. Number one, we recognize that consciousness participates in shaping reality. Number two, we recognize that social transformation depends upon personal transformation. Three, we affirm the unity that underlies diversity. Four, we seek to foster awareness of the spirit of love in our personal relationships in a community of freedom. And five, we seek right relationship with different ways of knowing, including science, reason, and intuition. Are any of those that jump out? They probably all jump out.
All jump out. All jump out. Well, let me take, for example, the concept of diversity and unity. I mean, in Masonry, the whole idea is that there is oneness. There's somehow, that oneness manifests itself in diverse ways. Therefore, any attempt to cleanse, to destroy that diversity is really destroying the oneness. How do we relate? And this is why I understand this concept in Masonry that became a motto of the United States. E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. It didn't say out of the one, many. Why out of many, one? Because the way the human condition has been going until the establishment of this great experiment, people are not understanding that we're one. We're already many. And hatred and wars, and they keep repeating the same things. They say they never learn the history, okay? The lessons of the past, because they keep repeating the past. When you keep repeating the past, you don't learn the lessons from the past. That's the idea, is to avoid repeating the past. So we were already many. The establishment of the great experiment is to reconnect, is to bring out of the many one, is to create an experiment for humanity to say, listen, yes, it can be done. We're going to start the experiment of reconnecting. And this is what in Masonry, which is there is oneness from which, but in this world in which we live, people see us already as diverse, see themselves as diverse. Unfortunately, they use the word diversity, meaning different and divided. So we need to reconnect. So out of the many, one. Out of the many, we have the one society of Freemasons. Out of the many, you have the community of freedom. Out of the many, you have the United States of America, the unity. Out of the many colors of the spectrum, you have the white light, sunlight. It is the source, okay? But now we're helping people reconnect how those seven really come together to form that one. So don't destroy the seven, don't destroy one of them, you destroy the whole. So, and that has to do with that level of consciousness. There were several points here. I just picked on one, but it's they all ring true to me. I mean, as a Mason, they make sense.
Right relationship with different ways of knowing, including science, reason, and intuition. That reminds me of the degrees of Freemasonry.
Yeah, and intuition is the last. Intuition is, this is when the person really connects. So when you're talking about going up the chain of consciousness, this is where it happens. It's really the intuition. The ultimate journey of the Mason is the more he or she is able to develop that intuition intuition will help, not in the superstitious, not instinct, okay? Intuition. That is when you're really connected to that whole, that consciousness, universal consciousness. That will not lead you astray. And that is difficult, very difficult to attain, very difficult to keep. So you hit it once here, then it disappears. You hit it every once in a while. As long as you keep following that path, it will help you along the way. It's intuition, ultimately. It helps you with clarity, by the way, much more than reason. Reason is fundamental because we don't want superstition. We have to have reason, but reason does not provide clarity necessarily. Okay, so that spirit thing is what helps you with the clarity. Again, we can use reason for all kinds of things. Beauty, coming back to love, that's what it is, and that's where the intuition is.
Well, I mean, it's interesting in terms of intuition because we all have intuitions. In some areas of our life, it's highly developed, in others, it's not. Mm-hmm. And in this case, for Mr. Fetzer, what was interesting was he had a business intuition that was very, very successful. And part of his life story was how do you develop that institution into other areas, intuition rather, into other areas of his life in order to make other areas of his life as successful. Mm-hmm. So intuition is a really interesting kind of concept, but it's not a simple one. It's not.
No, and it's difficult to even define. I mean, words are really very difficult. You can look up all kinds of definitions in the dictionary, of course, but really they don't. You can't. It's a bit like mystery. Mm-hmm. You can't put your hands on it.
Or spirit.
Or spirit. And that's fine. That's fine. Again, this is important to keep this larger sphere of a little bit of an unknown to help people define it their own way, because it has to do a lot with the experience of the human being as an individual. So, but it is, and you feel it. You can't describe it. You know it. I mean, it's the same I know in my life. I know I had that intuition of how I started our business. I mean, it was my intuition. I understood. A door closed, a door opened. I knew exactly what to do. How can I take that concept and create a business with a mission that has to do with advancing the great experiment? A business. Mm-hmm. It was my intuition.
Mm-hmm. Well, understanding science and developing reason, okay, that's pretty straightforward, how you go about doing that. But developing intuition is something a little bit more difficult. And I'm wondering, within Freemasonry, how is this addressed? How is this done?
Individual path. There is no magic formula. There's no group formula for it. It is really an individual path. So meditation is encouraged. Reflection is encouraged. Pursuing knowledge of schools of mysteries, esoteric societies. Look at various ways of developing that and tying your experience, what you're going through as a human being, to these concepts and figure out what signals are they. That's why it has to be individual, because you're reflecting internally on what your thoughts, what your actions are, having learned about or been exposed to these schools of mysteries. That's why mystery schools are very important. They explain certain phenomena, or they try to address certain phenomena that otherwise, science in of itself doesn't explain. So this leap of faith, for example, in geometry, the fact that there are axioms that we accept, and without them we can't move forward, and we cannot prove. I mean, that in of itself is a leap of faith. Mm-hmm. I mean, for anybody who says science has all the, here's the basis of science that has something mysterious about it. So mystery schools are very useful, very helpful for the individual to help him, her do that. Now what we do in lodges, people share experiences. They talk, they introduce different concepts for people to enrich themselves, but there is no collective way of really developing that intuition. Collectively, we can create the atmosphere. So you can have, many lodges have, moment of meditation before they start. People play with the lights or the candles, to create that to create the distance between the world before they enter the lodge and now this environment. So these are things we do collectively to help create a better environment. Music is used also, but no collective way of developing the intuition. By definition, it's an individual. That's why in this statement said it is really starts with the individual, then it goes outside. If the individual is unable to develop his or her own thing, awareness, ultimately going towards intuition in that sense, it's not going to happen collectively. It can't. It has to start with the self.
The principle of ritualistic magic, however, I think includes, and the ritual in the lodge includes, the idea that group practice creates an intensity, a spiritual intensity in the room, and which can create this this experience of the veil comes down momentarily, and then what you experience, or the third eye opens, and what you experience could be called intensive intuition, where that experience gives the person the absolute certainty that there is an intuitive aspect to the world, that there is something besides reason that can be experienced just like the reasonable side of the world. And then, to me, the person, once that shifts the worldview, and then intuition becomes more important, and the person just works on it, I think automatically then the person works on it, it develops, it goes, it builds on itself.
Yes, and that's what I meant by when I say the lodge creates the environment.
Right.
And that's part of it, and that's why we go through the ritual thing. There's that opens. It's all to help open, but then the individual will have to experience that. So it's yes, you're right.
Now, by the time I met John in the last 5 years, he, at least with me, at least in the home, that he was operating out of intuition. More than not. I mean, it was all an intuitive process that was going on there. So when he would say there are no coincidences, he was affirming that he was experiencing that. It wasn't just a matter of repeating something rotely. Mm-hmm. That was his experience. That seemingly coincidental things, he could feel the connections. He could experience those connections between everything.
And that is what is fundamental about intuition, and it is unique. It is the way to connect the whole. In other words, this is where the concept of universal consciousness, that concept of community of love, ultimately, again, what we're talking about as humans is where we connect. Let me explain why. You see, dogma builds on something else. So there are beliefs that I have, and my beliefs drive me. Science, reason, there are things that I understand and I accept, and assumptions that I make, and I move along with them. Intuition is what frees the individual. This is where it brings everything into balance. I mean, it's really fundamental to understand, and it's tied to the spirit. I mean, they're connected. And that's why a broader definition of spirit universally is fundamental.
Thank you. And then finally, let's go to what is a new mission statement that the Fetzer Institute has created just in the past couple months here. Mm-hmm. So it's not on the purple sheet. The purple sheet has the previous mission statement, so
what is this now?
It will
the
be
blue
amended.
Sheet?
Well,
okay.
I don't know.
But
right now it's a white sheet.
Yeah,
so
okay.
It's
purple is a nice color, by the way.
Purple's a nice color.
We use it in Masonry too.
Yeah. The new mission statement, the current and new mission statement of the Fetzer Institute is as follows: helping build the spiritual foundation for a loving world.
Well, I think that sums up everything we've been talking about to me. I mean, one sentence sums up everything we've been talking about. The Institute needs to be the incubator, the facilitator, to create this enlightened concept of freedom individually, and then the community concept. So you have a community of freedom, and that community of freedom, by definition, is not a community of freedom unless it is rooted in love. And listen, love is powerful. I know people say hate is powerful. Love is more powerful. It's amazing if people develop, and there are ways, and that's why rituals are important. That's what makes it. It helps the individual using the tools figure out how to employ it. Okay, when you apply it, you will feel the power of that. It's amazing. It's amazing. So, what a wonderful way of summing up everything. I like it. Yeah. It's cool. It's cool also.
There we go.